Hello and welcome to another TLDR UK video. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at one of the biggest and most ceremonial moments of the parliamentary year, the Queen's Speech. For those of you who don't know, the Queen's Speech is when, at the start of a new session of Parliament, the Queen makes a speech to the House of Lords outlining the government's new legislative agenda. The speech is written for the Queen by the government, and the whole thing usually lasts about 10 minutes. This Queen's Speech included 26 proposed bills, and obviously we're not going to have time to discuss all of those, so instead we're going to focus on the ones we think are the most important. If you want to watch the full thing though, it's linked down below. Before we dive in, do you feel like you're barely able to keep track of the news at home, let alone what's going on around the world? Well, if so, you should check out the Global Summary. Every week, we post an 8-minute video where we run down some of the top global news stories that you should know about, while providing extra reading if you want to dive deeper. So if you want to be more globally informed, check out the series on the TLDR Global channel. In fact, in the latest episode, we discuss France's potential upcoming civil war, Facebook's continued Trump ban, and free vaccines from vampires. And that video comes out a few hours after this one, so odds are by the time you're watching, there'll be a link in the description. Thanks so much for your support. Anyway, let's get to the important parts of the Queen's Speech. And the first one we want to discuss is the Electoral Integrity Bill. The government first referenced this bill in their 2019 Queen's Speech, so it's certainly been on the cards for a while. It basically does what it says on the tin. It requires voters, or at least first-time voters in Great Britain, to possess some sort of ID in order to vote, as well as limiting the number of postal votes that can be handed in on behalf of others, known as proxy votes. This is controversial because some people see it as voter suppression. That's because it only affects first-time voters, who, because of the demographics, are much more likely to be Labour voters, potentially suppressing this vote. Add to that, according to the Electoral Commission, almost a quarter of the electorate lacks a passport or provisional driving licence. Again, this will mostly be young people, so if the government decides to require these, as it currently suggests it will, it could significantly suppress younger voters. The government's argument is that voter ID laws will limit electoral fraud, but the Electoral Commission found literally 0 cases of electoral fraud in 2020, and only 6 cases the year before. It's possible that more cases do go undetected, or that the threat of electoral fraud might increase in the future. But the Electoral Commission today reckons that the UK government only has low levels of voter fraud. Now, to be fair to the government here, the Electoral Commission has recommended voter ID laws since 2014, but importantly, the Electoral Commission prefers the Northern Irish model, where everyone, not just first-time voters, has to provide photo ID, and you can get a free electoral photo ID from your local council, meaning that you don't need to have a driving licence or pay for a passport. Northern Ireland has used this model since 2003, and turnout seems to have been unaffected since then. However, the Northern Ireland model was piloted in some UK local elections in 2018, and turnout was affected. About 0.5% of voters failed to present a valid ID, and as such, they weren't allowed to vote. This might not sound like a massive number, but even tiny swings can make big differences in the first-past-the-post system. The Electoral Commission were also concerned that these pilot schemes were too small, and that on a national level, the impact on turnout could be significantly worse. Anyway, the long and short of it is that these are the main arguments for and against voter ID. But the key point is that if you're going to do voter ID, you should probably go about it using the Northern Irish model, making sure that the required ID is free and easily accessible, and that the rules apply to everyone, not just people who are more likely to vote for one party than the other. By the way, Tony Blair actually proposed this model in 2004, and this is what Boris Johnson had to say about it at the time.
The ID card scheme will cost anything between £5.4 billion and £20 billion, rather than on inefficient schemes which are recipes not just for waste, but also recipes for tyranny and oppression as well. And that's why I oppose the scheme. I'm on record as saying that if I am, in the unlikely event that this scheme comes to fruition. If I'm obliged to have an ID card by the emanations of the state, then I will take that ID card and I will snip it up and I will grind it in a Mulinex and I will eat it on my cornflakes. And I urge you all, by your votes at this forthcoming mayoral election, to show your displeasure with such a misconceived scheme and to give the government that has conceived it and the mayor that supports it the kick in the pants that they so deserve.
Moving on, the second interesting piece of legislation is the repeal of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. This was in the Conservatives' 2019 manifesto, and the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011 repeal bill was published in December 2020. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act was introduced by the coalition government back in 2011 and basically said that elections only happen every 5 years unless 1. A simple majority of the House of Commons supports a motion of no confidence in the government and no government can be found within 14 days, or 2/3 of the House support a motion for an election. The aim of the bill was to try and stop prime ministers from calling general elections prematurely just because they thought they could win. But it turns out it had some unintended consequences. Essentially, the following 3 things can be simultaneously true. 1. A majority of MPs don't support the government. 2. A majority of MPs don't want an election. And 3. MPs won't support any other government. This is what happened in September 2019 with Brexit. And as you might remember, Parliament basically just got stuck. Prior to the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the government could just turn any vote into a confidence vote, therefore forcing Parliament to either support the government or go to an election. This actually happened in 1993, when John Major made the vote on the Maastricht Treaty a confidence vote. Anyway, the point is that the Fixed Term Parliament Act made gridlock possible, and it did in fact gridlock Johnson, which is presumably why Johnson's keen to get rid of it. A third piece of legislation that was announced was the Animal Sentience Bill. This will form part of a wider package of bills that aim to improve animal welfare in the UK. The bill itself will put into law that animals with a spinal cord are sentient and are able to feel happiness and suffering. If passed, this will be the first time that animal sentience has been enshrined into UK law. As the bill hasn't been published, it's not exactly clear what changes this would have in relation to how animals are allowed to be treated, although it's expected that those who mistreat animals will face harsher criminal penalties. Alongside this bill, the government also announced that they'll introduce the Animals Abroad Bill and Kept Animals Bill. The former would ban the import of animals killed as part of trophy hunting, and the latter would ban primates from being kept as pets and stop live animal exports. Some may see this as a departure from traditional conservative policies. After all, ever since 2015, with the exception of 2019, the Conservative Manifesto has included some sort of promise to reintroduce fox hunting in some form. However, others would argue that the fact that the 2019 manifesto included many promises on animal welfare demonstrates that the current leadership has a commitment to improving the quality of life for sentient animals. In fact, animal sentience was mentioned in the 2019 manifesto, with it simply stating that we will bring new laws on animal sentience. Fourth and finally, there's one more bill worth briefly mentioning. The Advanced Research and Innovation Agency Bill. We don't have many details yet, but it seems to be about creating a new high-risk, high-reward research unit. This is Dominic Cummings' brainchild. He basically wanted to create a UK equivalent of DARPA in the US, and well, this seems to be it. It will be interesting to see what it actually ends up looking like, and who knows, it may reinvent the technological wheel. Anyway, no guarantees, and we only mention it because it's scientific, futuristic, and was sparked from the mind of Cummings. Those are only 4 elements of the Queen's speech, so if you want to check out the whole thing, there's a link to that video in the description. Also, let us know what you think of the government's plans, the ones we've discussed, and the other 20 which we didn't have time for in this video. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.